My name's Quick Pick Nick, and using a bunch of math and computer stuff, here are your locks and lotteries for Memorial Day, May 31st. I tried out this new format yesterday without a script, a little bit longer. Let me know if you guys like that new format, but I think it's going to be better for the YouTube algorithm overall for YouTube. I still have those starting 5, those shorter 1-minute videos on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find all those in the description below, but without further ado, the first pick of this lineup is going to be a player carrying over from that starting 5 video, and that's going to be Jordan Clarkson. He has yet to do poorly in this playoff series against Memphis. You can see he hasn't fallen below 20 fantasy points yet. He averaged 28 fantasy points per game in the regular season. I think that this is just a good recipe for success considering his price, his series average, and his regular season average. We're going to be taking one of those top 3 players, and it's going to be Ja Morant. I say this is more of a lottery player because once more, Ben Simmons and Westbrook might have huge games, so there's a chance that you want them in your lineup. But looking at Morant specifically, he only costs $8,200, which is rather low considering his season-long average and his series average. He had a few low points with his lowest performance of 38 fantasy points, not disappointing at all considering his low cost relative to the other expensive guys, and his high mark being in the 50s. There's no reason to believe that Morant is going to score any less than what he's already shown, and so I think he can only go up from here. Now that we've got our point guards in place, moving on to the shooting guard position, our first pick here is again going to be carrying over from that starting 5 video on social media, and that's going to be Donovan Mitchell, coming in at only $8,000, which is really low, and it might not sound like a low number as $8,000 is taking a big chunk out of your budget, but when you look at this guy's numbers, you see that he scored 40 fantasy points in game 3 against Memphis. He missed game 1 and game 2. He was sort of limited, coming back from a month and a half of off times, scoring 28 fantasy points, and with 40 in game 3, 40 points per game in the regular season, I think that this player is just going to be able to continue to roll that momentum into game 4 against Memphis. Mitchell seems plenty healthy. I think he's going to play his most minutes of this series so far, maybe surpassing 30 minutes, and for $8,000, that's well worth the cost to me. Lock Mitchell in. As for the second shooting guard, it doesn't really seem like we have much option aside from Bradley Beal at this point. I mean, Dillon Brooks has been very inconsistent in this series with Utah, and Joe Ingles has been sent to the bench with the return of Donovan Mitchell, so there's really nothing left to do except take Bradley Beal, which is why he's a lottery, because it's not like I wanted to take him, especially with his huge price tag, but there's just no one else who we can take at the position who I'd trust to score points. Taking a closer look at Bradley Beal, though, for $9,600, it's not that outrageous to ask for, especially when you look at his series performance. Scoring 51 in game 1, most recently in game 3, scoring almost 42 fantasy points. That's not bad at all. He's got a floor of 42 for this series, averaging 45 in the regular season per game. I think that's fine for $9,600. Not thrilled about it, but again, we have no other choice. Now moving on to small forward, the pick that we're going to take here, carrying over from that starting 5 video, is Danny Green. He's the lowest cost player in this lineup so far at $4,700. I think that's a steal. Green has clearly been involved in the playoffs for Philadelphia from what we've seen so far. In the last game Green played in the series, he scored 25 fantasy points. In game 1, he got 24. A little bit of a dip there in game 2, but I think we're going to see only more of Danny Green for the Sixers. As for the second small forward, there really aren't many options here. As you can see, obviously the most expensive player isn't even $7,000, but we're going to be taking that most expensive player, who is Kyle Anderson, coming in at $6,900. And the reason Anderson is such a valuable asset right now is because of his playoff performances for the Grizzlies so far. You can see in this series with Utah, his lowest performance is about 33 fantasy points in game 2, with games 1 and 3 both reaching 40 fantasy points for Anderson. And for $6,900, around 30 to 40 fantasy points is far more than enough, and so I'd say go ahead and take this player, maybe even lock him in at small forward, especially considering who else you're going to take at the position. I don't know, maybe lock in both Green and Anderson into your lineup. Moving on to power forward, it is probably a very expected pick considering my favor towards him throughout the playoff, and he hasn't steered us wrong yet. It's Tobias Harris, coming in at $7,900, and Harris has done well throughout the regular season, and especially so in this series with Washington. You can see his lowest mark in game 2, with only 23 minutes, he still managed to put up 33 fantasy points and then got injured, but outside of that low mark, he scored 41 and 51 in games 3 and 1 respectively. I don't expect that number to go down at all unless we get another injury, which is probably the worst jinx you can put on a player before a playoff game, but so overall I think you should lock in Harris. I don't think there's any reason not to take this player in this slate. As for the second pick, I think Jaren Jackson and Daniel Gafford are both very viable. It just didn't work out in this lineup in particular. So we're going to be taking Royce ONeal, mainly because he only costs $4,400 and still scores points. I'm going to show you what I mean here. He averaged almost 22 fantasy points per game in the regular season, which again for $4,400 is plenty of points to expect from a lower cost guy. And looking at this series in specific, you can see that he gets the minutes. I mean, he's played for more than half an hour in every playoff game in this series against Memphis. That's plenty of on-court time to expect maybe somewhere around 20 fantasy points, which is going to be more than enough for someone who saves us so much money and allows us to move that into other players like Harris and Beal and Mitchell. Finally, in my starting 5 video, I know I took Rudy Gobert mainly because he costs $8,500 and still shows up with 40 fantasy points per game in the regular season, and in this series in specific scoring 42, 52, and 35 fantasy points, which well warrants his cost. But seeing the rest of this lineup, I mean, there are just certain players I needed to get in. For example, Beal and Mitchell are must-takes in my opinion at shooting guard. I needed to have Danny Green was one of the cheap savers. I needed to have Tobias Harris at power forward. Kyle Anderson was another player I wanted to have. And so at the end of the day, there just wasn't enough money, but I still think that Dwight Howard here is a good lottery center player. Howard had a decent average in the regular season with 21 fantasy points per game, and in this playoff series, he does take a little bit of a backseat to Joel Embiid, which is expected, averaging somewhere in the high 10s, the high teens range. This was more so of a budgetary pick than anything else. For $4,300, if we see 19 points out of Howard again, I think that's more than enough to take him, just to free up the rest of the budget to take those superstars we already have. And that's what my model was able to come up with for this Memorial Day lineup on May 31st. Again, this lineup isn't set in stone in anything. There are players that I think you should definitely have in your lineup pretty much universally, like Beal and Mitchell at shooting guard. I don't think there are any two players here who are viable replacements in terms of cost effectiveness. And then at center, Dwight Howard is very much so a lottery pick, more so picked for budgetary reasons than anything else. So if you want to switch him out for Gobert or Embiid or even Valanciunas, I think those are all pretty smart picks. But anyways, that's what I have for this lineup. If you want to see more locks and lotteries, let me know if you like this new format in the comments, and make sure to subscribe if you like these lineup builders. In the meantime, this has been Quick Picnic, the intersection for sports, data analysis, and speed. Thanks for watching.